Oh, right. We'll only be using red now because we're talking about, oh, forgot to turn off the air conditioner. Because we'll only be talking about Marx. Okay. Marxism. I guess let me start with the three intellectual traditions from which it arose, all right? Hegelian philosophy. Abuses of the Industrial Revolution. One day it's going to be the name of my indie band. And, oh yeah, neoclassical economics. I'm putting neo in parentheses there for a reason that you'll see in a moment. All right. First off, when, I told you that I had every one of the non-mainstream chapters read by people in those schools of thought. And this was read for me by a well-known Marxist named Andrew Kleiman. And Professor Kleiman starts off with something along the lines of, heck, I'm not even sure Marxism exists anymore. That it's just become so diluted and fragmented that it's difficult to say if so-and-so is a Marxist economist or so-and-so is just influenced by some things in Marx or whatever, and it's just and we've got Marxist art, Marxist poetry, Marxist sociology, and its influence is so wide that it's hard to pin anything down with it. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to start with Marx himself, so that way it's a little bit more narrow. But these are, in John Harvey's opinions, and Kleiman didn't tell me otherwise, the major influences on Marx. Once again, like the neoclassicals, the things that were going on at the time that that influenced him, just like with Adam Smith, that influenced him and led him in the direction that he went. And the first was Hegelian philosophy. Hey, let me jot down here when Marx was alive. I don't know. And so I shall find out. I know it's the 1800s. Let's see here. When was Marx alive? 1818 to 1883. All right, I bring that up because I want to see when Hegel was alive. When was Hegel alive? 1770 to 1831. To 1831. So notice a similar situation to what we had with Adam Smith and Isaac Newton. There's a little bit of overlap there. Marx is going to be 13 when Hegel dies. And so when Marx goes to college, then this is what Hegel had said was very popular. And gosh, in writing the book, I tried to do as much. I got to tell you, I was terrified in every chapter because I knew I was going to send it to somebody who knew what they were talking about. So I did what I could trying to read some Hegel and get a handle on it. And here's the basics of it, right? And I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm going to be butchering this relative to someone in the philosophy department, but one of the essential elements is that history moves through these stages. The feudalism, capitalism, and so forth, these stages, and they're moving to better states of the world. Things are getting better, all right? Things are improving. And we'll eventually reach a state in which we all get to fulfill ourselves. We all get to live our lives the way we want to, and we feel like accomplished human beings and so forth, according to Hegel. So history's getting better, all right? And what happens in each stage of history is, I used to teach, I don't know if you've heard Hegel in another class. As I mentioned in an earlier video, I was also a political science major, so a lot of the stuff that I was learning in political science, I also heard in economics and vice versa. The first time I ever was taught Hegel, it had to do with this thesis, antithesis, synthesis stuff. Well, Andrew Kleinman told me that was wrong. I've been doing it that way for years. And I looked it up, and he's right. That was a simple way of explaining Hegel, also the wrong way. So if you've heard that in another class, keep it to yourself, of course, but it turns out that that's not a valid representation of Hegel's thought. Rather, in this synthesis, or this thesis antithesis stuff, he's like, no. Look, a new stage of history evolves. Feudalism. And we're like, wow, this is a lot better than the previous stage, say, slave-based economies or whatever under the Roman Empire. I'm picking the West in particular because Hegel was in the West. And we're thinking this is pretty good. But as the system evolves, as time passes, we begin to realize imperfections. All right, imperfections. As it says here, history moves through stages from incompleteness towards rationality and completeness as flaws are observed and addressed. Okay, so here's a silly example. A couple of Thanksgivings ago, my parents were here, Melanie's parents were here. It was pouring down rain outside, and we have a pool room, which is down there on that part of the house. And unfortunately, it does not mean swimming pool, it means billiards, and it was filling with water. Because it turns out that it used to be part of the patio, but before we moved here, somebody closed it in and made another room. And the floor in the pool room is here, and the sidewalk outside is above it. So any water accumulating here, if it got down through the cracks, was just gushing in over here. First of all, father-in-law and father, I don't need any help. Please go away. That was a very stressful moment. But I said, Melanie, can you get them to do something else? So I got them to bail while I was trying to plug all the leaks. Every time I plugged the leak, a new problem would emerge. Every time I thought, okay, I've got it under control. Oh crap, now that also caused so-and-so to happen. That's kind of what Hegel is saying here. Hegel is saying that what happens is we come up with this new and better stage of history because we're always improving. But as we're like, this is much better. Oh no, that part sucks though. All right, and we're eventually moving towards this wonderful state of the world at the end where, again, we're all fulfill our lives and so forth. Now, this process is being guided by the Geist, which is basically German for ghost or spirit. That there's this sort of spirit that is planting the ideas in our heads, and we are then employing these new systems. Is that Geist God? I remember when I was trying to figure that out and reading Hegel, and my recollection is that it depends on which Hegel you read. That sometimes it sounds like that and sometimes it doesn't. It's just like the Force in Star Wars. It's something that binds us all together, all right, this Geist thing. And, okay, so he believes this is what's going on, and perhaps what was going on in Germany at the time, or the states that would become, Germany's Germany. When did German unification take place? Not reunification. When was German unification? 1871. All right, so Germany becomes Germany later. Not at all during Hegel. And so it's still a bunch of individual states and Prussia. So at any rate, he figures things are getting better. And perhaps this was something that was appealing to people at the time. And it was, and what do you do with this information? Well, you study history. Because if you study history long enough, you might be able to figure the direction it's going next. Might be able to figure out the underlying logic of the Geist, of where it's taking us. And I don't know, again, I was trying to think of an analogy one day in class, and I was like, well, how the hell could you do that? All right. What's the next number? I mean, you know what it is, right? So you're studying this pattern, and that allows you to predict the next stage. Now, obviously, if we're talking about stages of history, it's much more complex and subtle, but the idea is that if I can understand this, I may be able to figure out where it's going. So, this was a very popular concept. Let me make sure I'm not skipping something. don't think so. Popular concept when Marx was in college, and he was big into the Hegelian stuff too. So that was a big influence on him. Now Marx is also going to say that history moves through stages, but these stages are going to be purely economic. I was using the example earlier, slave-based economies to feudalism, to capitalism, to socialism, to communism. Those are the stages. So he's going to agree with that part, but he's going to make it all about economics. And he's also going to say, hey, there's no Geist. That actually there's an internal logic to the evolution of economic systems, which I'll talk about later. And we don't really have much to do with it at all. Our role is actually somewhat passive, as opposed to Hegel, where the Geist is planting these ideas in our heads and then we're going and carrying them out. So the idea that history moves through stages and it's going to get better, remember that, is going to influence Marx. He's also looking out his window when he's alive and seeing the worst parts of the Industrial Revolution. The working conditions were not good for those affected by the Industrial Revolution. Now, there seems to be some agreement under historians that they weren't necessarily worse than they were before when they were peasants. They weren't necessarily worse, but they sure as heck weren't better. And also, working the farm, you're in charge of your kids and what they're doing. And whereas at the factory, somebody else is the boss. It was a very a shock in terms of the change in the family structure and so forth. So this was resisted. Plus, don't forget what I said under the neoclassical stuff about political individualism in 1776 and the idea that I should be allowed to be in charge of my own life. Well, 1776 is well after when Marx wrote. This is Marx at the top here. And so he's well aware of this. In fact, he's actually a big fan of Western freedoms. And so he's looking at, what I was going to say was, and so the people under feudalism weren't necessarily convinced they should be allowed to be free. The people under the Industrial Revolution were like, hey, why am I putting up with this crap? All right, so there was a sense of, I don't have to put up with this. But it certainly was not a pleasant period of history. And the question becomes, but did it then lead to a more pleasant period of history? But that's beside the point. Right now, what we're thinking is that Marx is looking at his window and he's seeing Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim working for Mr. Scrooge. Well, Tiny Tim doesn't work there, but and he's thinking, this sucks. This current stage of history sucks. I think that history moves through stages and to, better and better periods. And I think that right now the stage of history we're in really sucks. So therefore, I'd like to understand more about economics. So I'm going to start reading the work of economists, who at that point are Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus, the classical economists in the mainstream tradition. Now, I told you before that neoclassical just means new classical. I describe the Marx as being influenced by neoclassical economics. Well, yeah, except at that point it was just called classical, all right? And that's going to be Adam Smith and David Ricardo especially. And so again, Marx buys into this idea of the stages of history stuff. He also thinks the current stage really sucks. But he really wants to, he's not the kind of guy just to spray paint do they have spray paint in that? To paint a placard and start protesting. He wants to understand it, all right? He is a scholar. He wants to understand it. So he turns to the people who have been studying economics already, which, when he's writing, is the classical economists, all right? Which surprised the heck out of me the first time I learned this in History of Economic Thought class back when I was in college. Like, Marx was heavily influenced by Adam Smith? Wow. So Marx basically adopts the economic model that they put together, but then he comes to a different conclusion. That's interesting. All right, so let's see. What have we got next? Okay, let me show you this. And I think I've got to decide where I'm going to stop this. So I can break this into segments. Okay. let me tell you about the labor theory of value, because it's going to be really core to Marx's argument. All right, so remember, Marx is looking out the window and he's seeing Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim getting screwed over by Mr. Scrooge. And he wants to understand, what is it about this stage of history? Remember what I said about Hegel and the idea that history moves through stages from incompleteness towards rationality and completeness, which means, by rationality, apparently Hegel meant a world in which you could live your life the way you wanted to, you could feel fulfilled. And incompleteness means we ain't there yet, and completeness means we are. As flaws are observed and addressed. All right, so Marx spends his career looking at the flaws in capitalism. He's trying to figure out what is it that's wrong with this system. All right, so 99.9% of all his writing is about capitalism. It's very little about communism or socialism, which are two separate stages, by the way. And so he's trying to understand the internal contradictions of capitalism. He's trying to understand the things that are going to eventually destroy capitalism, the flaws, and the source of the negativity. What is the ultimate source of the negativity? Well, I'll tell you. I happen to know. Well, actually, there's several, but I like to do this one. Let me just do it this way first. Premise 1. All value is created by how close am I getting? I believe I can get process in. Process, yes, of labor. I'm going to write it all out, then I'll explain it. Premise 2. Workers, labor, and capitalists own the means of production. Premise 3. Only those who create value deserve income. Only those who create value deserve income. Premise 4, and then we'll have our conclusion. Capitalists earn income. Capitalists earn income in the form of profits. Uh-oh, I forgot I run out of space there, don't I? Come back over here. Profits, period. Therefore, here's our conclusion. The capitalist must be the capitalists. Oh, who invented the term capitalism? Karl Marx. The capitalists must be retaining some of the value and I hope I'm doing all right on space. Yeah, this can be perfect. Value created and earned by the workers. Uh-oh. I said it was going to be okay. Workers. Okay, barely. All right. Oh, I should have started a little higher. Okay. Here is, in very simple form, one of Marx's arguments. All right. Premise 1. The ultimate source of value in an economy is the amount of labor expended to create the good or service. So, for example, if it took 1 hour to make this and 2 hours to make this, then this ought to be worth twice as much as this. All right, so these would be equivalent. These are 1 hour each. This is 2 hours. What if you used a machine and did it faster? Well, then in that case, then the amount of time used to make the machine also must be taken into account. And we'll have some more stuff about that later. And actually, this wasn't his idea. All right, this first one is not his. This first one is coming straight from the classical economists. So that's coming from Adam Smith and David Ricardo. All right? So he's saying, look, the thing that creates value in an economy is the amount of labor you expend. All right? The more labor you expend, the more socially useful labor, he says, because if I decide to take 10 hours to make this just because I am lazy, that doesn't make it a 10-hour pen. It means, relative to the amount of technology and stuff like this. So all value is created by the process of labor. Now, so again, he's not being controversial yet. He's only taking an assumption straight from mainstream economics at this point. Now, that's no longer an assumption in mainstream economics, but it was in 1848. I believe that's the year of the Communist Manifesto. Almost certain. What year was the Communist Manifesto? 1848. So, he's not being controversial yet. Second one. He's just laying out some definitions. He's saying, I want to call the people who undertake this process called labor, I want to call them workers. And I want to call the people who own the factories, I'm going to call them capitalists. Okay. And we can call these people, jerks and, I don't know, whatever. I keep coming up with stuff that then I think to myself, that might actually be offensive. Jerks and... it doesn't matter. All I can think is rude stuff right now. I'm tired. Melanie got up really early and the dog made me get up along with her. All right, so, but it doesn't matter what you guys say. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Those are just definitions. Now, this does not preclude someone from carrying out both roles, by the way. Someone could be part worker and part capitalist, no problem. But for simplicity, let's just say it's one or the other. We have people who undertake labor, people who own factories. Now, here's a value judgment. Only those who actually created some value ought to be allowed to take away from that pile, right? Only those who helped create the pile of stuff that we made in our country should be allowed to take from the pile of stuff. Now, we can have exceptions like, like right now I have money taken out of my salary for retirement, all right? So I've saved up some of my rights to take from the pile, but I'm only allowed to take from the pile if I earned the right by adding to the pile at some point. So I don't know that it's a terribly controversial value judgment, but it is a value judgment. We're saying here that only those who create value deserve to take. And then last is an empirical observation. Hey, I looked out the window just now. You know what I saw? Capitalists are allowed to earn income in the form of something we call profits. All right? So this is just that I looked out the window and I saw this. So putting all these together, all value is created by the process of labor. Only workers labor. And if only those who create value deserve income, only workers deserve income. All right? Only workers deserve income is the obvious conclusion from the first three. From the first three, the obvious conclusion is if only, let's see, let me circle this in another color. Value is created by labor, workers labor, and only creating value deserves income. Well, okay, so let's back up here. If only creating value deserves income, and in fact, let's jump up to the first one, and only laboring creates value, then only workers deserve income. All right, only workers deserve income. But I just looked out the window. And it turns out that's not the case, that actually capitalists earn income too. Well, they must be retaining some of the value that the workers created. They must be keeping for themselves some of the stuff that workers actually created, all right? And that's a tough argument to fight against in the middle of the 19th century when this is coming from the classical economists. The first premise is coming straight from them. The second one's just definitions. There's no problem with that. The third one's probably not terribly controversial. And the fourth one we're pretty confident is true as well. So he's saying this is why Bob Cratchit leads this horrible existence under Ebenezer Scrooge in the Christmas Carol. I was assuming you knew that. in the Christmas Carol is because Ebenezer Scrooge is keeping things that Bob Cratchit actually created. He's keeping the income that really Bob Cratchit deserves. So, this is a problem. Now, capitalism is better than what came before it. Because remember, Marx believes, along with Hegel, it's getting better. So Marx sees capitalism as superior to feudalism in terms of being fair to the screwed over class, which in this case is going to be the workers. It's just not there yet, all right? So this is why when we look out the window, we see these abuses of the Industrial Revolution, right? That's where they're coming from. Let's see. I was going to tell you something else about this. You don't have to believe in the labor theory of value to believe that this is a problem. That's called the labor theory of value right there. It outlines in the book several other ways that Marxists can also argue that it's exploitative. Believe it or not, this statement is actually in Adam Smith. All right, Adam Smith, and I'd have to go back and look for it now. It's been years since I've read, over 30 years since I've read The Wealth of Nations. But somewhere in the book he says, hey, wait a minute. If only labor creates value and only workers labor, then capitalists don't deserve any income. That can't be right. And perhaps capitalists deserve some income for, we'll use Horned Frog Purple here, maybe risk, all right? Okay, Adam Smith, but then you need to go back and rewrite the rest of the book. Because the rest of the book is based on this. And so when Marx is reading Smith, he's like, oh my God, that's it, Adam Smith. You nailed it. And he credits him. You nailed it way back in the 18th century. That's what's going on. You didn't want to believe it, but you saw it, all right? So that's another interesting thing about this, how much Marx was influenced by the classical economists and how much he was really just using their models and giving credit all the way to figure out what was going on in the economy. So I'll show you some examples later of how we don't have to believe this if we are Marxists to still come to the conclusion. Although at conferences where there have been Marxists there, that is kind of a big deal to a lot of them. They're like, well, what else creates value? And we'll do a school of thought later, the institutionalists, who will say a lot of other stuff creates value. But right now, we're on Marxism, so we're going to say that just labor creates value. Let's see, is that all I wanted to do of that? Anything else on that, John? Oh, yeah. Originally in the chapter, in the book, I had said that Marx thought this was unfair. And the guy that read this chapter for me, Dr. Kleiman, said, oh no, he never said that. He said that under capitalism, this was perfectly just. It wasn't healthy for the workers, but it was perfectly just because the rules of capitalism say they're allowed to keep some of it. And by the way, for some reason, Marx thought the ratio was about 50-50. That if you created $10 worth of labor, then the capitalist gave you $5 and kept $5. I'm not sure why he thought it was exactly 50%, but anyway. But as I say, Kleiman said, oh, no. Marx didn't say this was unfair. Because fair is a function of the system you're in, and capitalism is the system we're in. So it's perfectly fair. In fact, he pointed me to a quote where Marx says something like, the owner of capital never takes anything that wasn't theirs to start with. This is legally mine. This is under the system mine, these profits. And so it's not unfair, but it's unhealthy. Because what's happening is that workers are unable to live their lives the way they want to and to get the fruits of their labor and so forth. We'll get into a little bit more of that in just a minute. And I believe I'll stop right there and start another video for the next concept. Yes, it's right about a half an hour. Thank you.